morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning and welcome. And I'm so happy to see you all in the sanctuary and those of us who are zooming in from near and far and across the galaxy. Welcome. We are so excited and happy to have you join us today. So with that, I will say welcome, enjoy, and let the games begin.
The opening words are from Charles Dickens, who was one of the authors who first taught me that paradoxes and complications were the mark of understanding the world. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a fair face on the throne of France. In both countries, it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes that things in general were settled forever. It's very nice to be here. I participated in a few events for Easter. I think I did from home. And then the Christmas Eve service, where it was just a very select group of Tina, Sharon, and me in the sanctuary, and the world via Zoom. And it's nice to be here in this hybrid setting with some real faces in the room and some virtual faces out there in internet land. I want to have an opening reading from a fellow who I don't know, and I'm going to talk a little bit about him and about the subject of the reading a little bit later. The first time I read this tribute to a man who had been important in this fellow's life, it really hit me. The author of this piece is a man named Dustin Degree, who I think now has a job with the Vermont Department of Labor. He used to be a state senator from Franklin County. We live to survive our paradoxes. The first words I heard from Ed Webley's booming voice as he addressed Bellows Free Academy's class of 1999. I was 14, sitting next to my mother at my brother's graduation, staring blankly into the coming summer when my ears caught those words. We live to survive our paradoxes. Gord Downie, the tragically hip. There, in the pomp and circumstance and boredom of a high school commencement, was the coded language of someone who understood his audience. Like any good writer, he had hooked me with the opening line. At the end of freshman year, I wanted to move into accelerated English. The chair of the English department told me I didn't have the grades to be moved up. My teachers said my work didn't merit that type of change, and the guidance counselor told me I'd be better off to continue on the mid-level track that I was already on. It would be easier. They were right. I went to Coach Webley. I was no one to him, a freshman football player, an attendance issue, a kid who would leave class with the bathroom pass on Tuesday and come back with it 2 days later. And as the assistant headmaster, I was his problem. But after a swift and definitive no from the first 5 adults I had spoken to, he wasn't dismissive. He asked me to write him an essay on why I thought I should be moved up. I have no idea what that essay said. I wrote it, gave it to him, and never saw it again. But the next fall, he had convinced whoever he needed to convince to move me on the condition that I'd produce 2 copies of every paper I wrote that year, hand one in to my teacher and one to him. I'd get 2 papers back, redraft, rinse, and repeat. More than once, I was working on papers for him that had long since been graded, logged, and forgotten by my teacher. No extra credit, no bonus points, just a never-ending lesson in the drafting process, persuasion, punctuation, and prose. I wasn't good at school. At times during my adolescence, I was at war with it. I hated busy work. I didn't do poster projects or dioramas. I didn't do homework I didn't see the point to. I detested monotony and hated being talked down to. Read the books, write the papers, he'd say. So I read the books and wrote the papers. Before he left for Essex, he took me into a book closet full of old numbered classroom sets and handed me a copy of every book in the collection. Shakespeare, Faulkner, Hemingway, everyone needs a library, he said. Ed Webley personally willed me through high school. I can tell you unequivocally that I would not have graduated without him. Not only in that he was always there for me, sense that most people understand when they think fondly of that one teacher or coach who pushed them towards success, but in the I didn't show up to school, failed classes I had no business failing, and needed to be dragged through by the scruff of my neck kind of way. At the beginning of my senior year, after he had left for Essex, I was facing academic probation because I hadn't followed through with the clerical details needed to officially drop an elective at the end of my junior year. The new football coach said I wasn't going to be able to play in at least the first 4 games. The principal told me it was a good lesson in personal responsibility. And when I went to talk to the headmaster, he pointed to a stack of binders on academic procedure, recited his resume to me, and then told me to go home and grow up. I got in my car, drove to Essex High School, and camped out in Ed's office. A few hours later, he walked in, surprised to see me. He brought me in and heard me out. Jesus, Degree, I told you to deal with this. He was right, he did tell me. He picked up the phone, called his former colleagues, and convinced whoever he needed to convince that it was his fault, and then told me to go see the headmaster. This isn't the lesson you need to learn right now, he told me. We scrimmaged St. Johnsbury Academy that night. I played and we lost. I know both made him happy. We stayed connected as I grew up and he grew older, through the good and the bad and the truly terrible. He supported me. He challenged me. He helped me succeed even as his world was falling apart. He encouraged me. His encouragement never, ever stopped. He always had time for his problem child. It took me a while to understand that the lesson he was trying to shield me from was that the world just isn't fair and never will be. That mistakes can bury you, and sometimes, no matter how hard you try, failure can be the predetermined outcome. It's not lost on me that he knew that better than most. Ed loved Shakespeare. He loved the grandeur and the elegance and the tragedy. It's why he loved the drama of football, of teaching, and of kids like me. The understanding that there's more to a character than what's on the page, and a world that lives beyond the simple reading of plain text. He knew that the best heroes have flaws. He understood that the paradox makes the story worth reading, worth thinking about, and something more than a recounting of connected people and events. He also knew that the best stories always leave you wanting more. I wish we could have had a little more time with him. I hope he's found the peace he'd been searching for so long, and the quiet he deserves. But mostly, I hope he rests knowing his mark on me and so many others is indelible. Thank you, Coach Webb. It's now time for our offering and food collection. Our next piece of music is going to be Amazing Grace. I just wanted to say a little bit about Amazing Grace before we head that. Before COVID, I did services on a regular basis up at the Springfield Correctional Facility, and Amazing Grace is often referred to as the prisoner's national anthem. Very popular with prison audiences. It was written, as I'm sure you all know, by John Newton, who began his career as a slave trader and ended his career as a leading British abolitionist, living long enough to see the end of the slave trade in England. But it's worth thinking about as we listen to the words of the song and think about the song that he was, like all of us and all of humanity, a flawed person who lived through a tumultuous time and changed his mind. I don't know if you've ever seen a recording of Arlo Guthrie singing Amazing Grace, but he has done some wonderful recordings of Amazing Grace where he tells the story in a very dramatic way of John Newton changing his mind. I was looking for that as I was preparing for the service and stumbled across another singing of Amazing Grace by Arlo Guthrie. It lasted 15 minutes, not quite as long as Alice's Restaurant, but fairly long, and he would interrupt it with stories, and I figured 15 minutes, I'm sure I'm going to hear that story that I want to hear again, but I didn't hear that story. I heard some other great stories, including one that had a phrase in it that I just loved, which he was talking about, I guess, buying the church in Stockbridge that figures in Alice's Restaurant and turning it into a community center. And he said that while he was working there mopping the floor one night, the minister from the church across the street came by and said to him, what are you doing? He said, "We're mopping the floor." The minister said, "No, I want to know, what are you doing with this church? What kind of a church is it going to be?" And Arlo Guthrie said, "It's going to be a bring your own God church." And I don't know whether that's been applied to this denomination. I think it ought to apply to every denomination, because it ought to be that you bring your own God to church. So we're going to hear the virtual choir now sing Amazing Grace. I hope you can survive the paradox of combining last week's message with today's, since much of what I'm sharing with you is stuff that I've encountered on social media. As I mentioned, Ed Webley was not somebody I ever met during his life. It was only a Facebook post by this fellow Dustin Degree, who Mark Zuckerberg tells me is my friend. I don't know how it came about, but he posted that and I read it. And then I got very interested in what I read. The message that I want to convey today has to do with how what makes life worth living, what makes this a wonderful world, as well as a terrible world, the best of times and the worst of times, is that we can, in the words of F. Scott Fitzgerald, hold two competing ideas in our head at the same time. And that's the mark of intelligence. We need to remind ourselves always that life is not either black or white. People are not either good or bad. Ideas are not either right or wrong. it's kind of the opposite of the, I don't understand much about computers, but I know that everything in computers is either a 0 or a 1. So that music we just heard is made up of a bunch of zeros or ones. And the microprocessors that take the electrical impulses that turn them into images and sound and everything else have to think either in a 0 or a 1 term. I may be totally wrong. I don't know. If somebody knows a lot about computers and knows that that's not how they work, that they really work by the hand of God, something just straighten me out afterwards. But we aren't microprocessors. We should be macroprocessors, or try to be macroprocessors, where we can understand that things aren't either 0 or 1. There can be people who do atrocious things who are very good about some other things that they do. I had an interesting conversation a few weeks ago when my grandchildren and their family were off on vacation, and the farm substitute they had engaged is a neighbor of ours up the road in Wethersfield, who is the commander of the state police barracks in Westminster. And we were talking one night about when he was coming with his son to do the chores, about how you deal with people who are being apprehended or put in handcuffs or put in the back of the cruiser or being charged with crimes in a way that doesn't convey to them that you think they are just awful, terrible, worthless human beings. And I know in the course of my life, I've run into a number of people who've talked about police officers and judges and prosecutors who may have ended up sending them to jail, but who they felt recognized their humanity and treated them as a human being. And an idea came to mind when I was having this conversation with the state trooper, that when my car isn't working right, I take it someplace to get it fixed. I don't turn to my car and chew it out and say, you know, you're really worthless because you won't go forward when I put you in gear here right now. I want to fix it. And I think we've kind of forgotten that human beings, in some ways, we ought to treat as well as we treat our cars. We don't throw the car away the first time it disappoints us. Back to Ed Webley and Dustin Degree. After I read that tribute that I just read to you, I posted it on Facebook, and there were a number of comments from people who I do know, who knew Ed Webley and referred to what a wonderful human being he was and what a sad life he had led. And they didn't get specific, but I got curious. And with the world at my fingertips, thanks to the internet, I did a little research. And I found the first thing that I found that seemed to be what might have been referred to about when Dustin Degree said through the good, the bad, and the truly terrible. I found the obituary for a young woman named Megan Angelina Webley, written by Ed Webley about his daughter, published October 7th, 2019. I'm going to read it to you. Megan Angelina Webley passed away unexpectedly at age 31 on Sunday, September 29th. Specifically, she died of an overdose, finally losing her battle with addiction. She was in Manchester, New Hampshire, seeking treatment for her addiction. We have no clear picture of what went wrong. Megan leaves behind her mother, Dorothy Provenzano of Boca Raton, Florida, her father, Edwin Webley of Middlebury, Vermont, and her brother, Michael Henderson of Los Angeles, as well as many loving cousins, aunts, and uncles. She also left behind 4 beautiful children who were collectively the light of her dark life. Though shadowed by opiate addiction, Megan enjoyed a big smile and an infectious laugh. She loved all kinds of music, dancing, and doing her makeup. Empathetic to the extreme, she was the underdog's biggest advocate. And against all circumstances, when she could be, she was a loving, gentle, and doting mother. Just last year, she spent a few hours in the pool with all 4 kids. The youngest has since been adopted by a loving family. And it was a rollicking madcap outing featuring a water slide and peals of laughter. It was at that point when she was the happiest we had seen her in years. Megan grew up in St. Albans in Georgia, Vermont, participating in dance and swimming. She proved to be an adventuresome reader and a fearless jumper off cliffs. But on July 1st, 2005, she was once again at a cliff on Eagle Bay in Burlington. I was sitting at my desk on the first day of a new job, and a Vermont State policeman called to tell me to drive to the emergency room at the University of Vermont Medical Center. I was told she had been pushed off the cliffs and hit the rocks below with her face. Having been rescued by a man in a kayak and EMT, she was being stitched up and her jaw was wired shut. They suspected a TBI, but when they prescribed her liberal doses of opiates, she lost control of her life. She would be in and out of rehab and jail for the next 14 years. To editorialize, I'm hoping the Department for Children and Families rethinks its mission to be the punisher of addicted mothers, the separator of families, and the arbiter of children's futures, and instead embrace a mission of enhanced rehabilitation. We as a state are overwhelmed by addiction. We have almost nowhere to turn. I encourage enhanced funding for treatment in general and using DCF as a gateway for mothers with addiction to get help, because as one would guess, once the mother is separated from her children, desperation sets in, even with the brightest and most determined of mothers. And Megan Angelina Webley was that bright and determined mother with a fatal disease and a dearth of treatment options. Submitted by Megan's father. Well, that got me interested, and I did a little more research. Came across a 7 days article about the horrors of the Chittenden County Community Correctional Center, Vermont's only prison for women. They talked about Megan Webley as one of the people they had talked to. This was written back while she was still alive. And then there was a later article in 7 days that made reference to the obituary. But during her life, when addiction had taken over her life, she turned, as addicted people do, the only things that she could find to support her addiction, and that included theft and prostitution. And among her prostitution clients was a fellow who was a guard at the prison. That led to another whole series of awful things happening in her life. I did some more research, and I discovered some of the other difficult and horrible and truly terrible times in Ed Webley's life. Was one summarized in this press release. State police say the co-principal of the Danville school has been arrested for embezzling almost $1,600. Edwin Webley, 60, was seen on video footage removing cash and checks from a school safe, police say. The money and checks had been placed in the safe on the evening of February 13 and was discovered missing on February 16. Superintendent Matt Forrest told police he reviewed video camera footage that showed a man removing money from the safe. That man was identified as Webley. He previously worked as co-principal at Virginia's High School, left that post last spring to take a job in Danville. While working at Virginia's, he was cited for driving under the influence. In that February 2012 incident, police reported that his wife called officers after Webley crashed his car into his garage. As I read these stories and absorbed them, I thought about the complexity of people in our world. although we're bombarded with messages through much of the media, that things are either black or white, good or bad, deep down, we know better. We know from the great books we've read, the great characters from myth and from life, and people we know, that everyone is a mixed bag. It's interesting, I don't read much detective fiction, but I am often struck by some of the trashy but absorbing detective novels you read, that the villains are just villains. There's no, they don't have any redeeming characters. They are just bad through and through. Or maybe they hid it for a while behind some veneer, but the detective discovered that they are just absolutely horrible. And then I compare them to the people in Dickens. You know, you think of some of the characters who do bad things in some of Dickens's books and other works of great literature, and they're always multidimensional. They always have things that are really appealing and draw you to them. They aren't just one-dimensional bad. But I think in the modern world, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the modern world of politics and how we apply that so totally. I watch, it bothers my wife, and so I have to do it with headphones, but I watch Fox News every night. And I know our president is a senile, doddering fool who can't string a sentence together and trips walking up airplane steps and is just totally out to lunch. And if I switch over to MSNBC or CNN, I know that Donald Trump is absolutely a crook and a fool and a slanderer and a this and a that. I remember years ago going to a peace conference organized by a church up in Burlington, and it was run by a great big, huge fellow who was a Eastern Catholic priest. So he was able to have a family. He had 13 kids. And he was a very charismatic guy. And he stood in front of this group of peace activists and he looked us in the eye and he said, God loves, this is back in the early 2000s, God loves Saddam Hussein. And all these peace activists kind of looked at each other. We know that. That's right. And then he said, and God loves Dick Cheney. Peace activists had a hard time with that, because we could embrace that, yes, we need to be more understanding of our nation's enemies, but when it came to the people we considered the villains, we needed to be reminded. Now, of course, Dick Cheney has gotten rehabilitated. That's a dated story because through his daughter, who 5 years ago, probably all left-leaning people thought was terrible, they now think she's courageous and a profile in courage. But the lesson of all this is that everybody's a mixed bag. That was the title of a sermon I gave after John McCain died, because there were a whole lot of things writing about John McCain as if he were the most wonderful person who ever walked the face of the earth. And then there were people saying, oh no, John McCain is terrible. Well, he was good and he was bad. He did great things and he did lousy things. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. We are intelligent enough to understand that. But yet we kind of need to be reminded over and over and over again of that fact. Some years ago, I was conducting a wedding at a wedding place up in Proctorsville. And I met with the family ahead of time, and I got to know the extended family. And at one point, a sister, the bride, arrived. And she looked like she had been through a lot in her life. And I got talking with her. And there was some discussion, maybe her boyfriend was in the discussion, and somebody used the term dysfunctional family. You have to understand we're from a dysfunctional family, or that's a very dysfunctional family. And I said, stop for a minute. I said, you know, when I was a kid, I never heard that term dysfunctional family. But what we call dysfunctional family certainly existed when I was a kid, and they existed when the Bible was written. There's plenty of dysfunctional families in the Bible. Every time in between, I said to her, because she was about my age, I said, what did we call them back then? I said, we called them families. And I think of that's what families are. That's what the human race is. There are the alcoholic parents and the drug addicted children and the mentally ill cousins and the people who've never been able to hold a job. And there are the driving type A personalities who maybe someday crash and burn. And we love them all. And that's the lesson we need to embrace in a binary world. The complexity is what makes life worth living. Larry Church is here, and a few years ago, Larry was helping me with the project that I've been doing for a while in Springfield. And there was a guy who he was quite taken with, who I was quite taken with, and I spent a lot of time talking to him and trying to help him understand. He was somebody who saw things as either black or white, good or bad. Somebody was either good or not. And, you know, and this fellow had a complicated life and made plenty of mistakes, but he preferred to look at the mistakes other people had made. And I remember sitting with him on a back porch and asking him to do a little mental exercise that I found useful. And that was to look at whatever he could see with his eyes and tell me all the things that were good about it. And then look at the same landscape and tell me all the things that were bad about it. It's a good mental exercise to do, because if I'm looking at that banner back there and I see that it's not really centered on the piece that goes across. I remember a few years ago when I was preaching in Perkinsville, there was a person who I really liked, and she was a very thoughtful, intellectual, educated person. And after a service one day, she said, "Will, I need to talk to you about something." And I thought it was going to be something about what I had just talked about. She said, "There's a candle behind you that's crooked, and it really bothers me. I can't think of anything else because of that crooked candle." We look around the world and there is beauty and there is horror. There is perfection and there is imperfection. Human beings, issues, we need to embrace that complexity, the paradoxes. By the way, I didn't know when I back to Dustin Degree and what he had to say about Ed Wedley, that phrase, "we live to survive our paradoxes," apparently is a line from a rock song by somebody named Gord Downie with a group called the Tragically Hip. And I had no idea until I Googled it what he was talking about. But apparently that was the line at the beginning of the commencement speech that got Dustin Degree hooked on what Ed Wedley was having to say. I could go on, but I think you get my point, that we live in a world where what makes it exciting and fascinating is the complexity. It isn't two teams and we're going to root for one over the other. We're all in this together. We're talking with Sharon a little bit about what I was going to talk about the other day, and talking about the divide, political divide, whatever kind of divide you want to talk about. And all of a sudden, an idea popped in my head, which is if you think about a divide between people, and then you change the perspective, so instead of being here on the ground, looking at the two sides separated, you're up above, looking down, they're all on the same plane. And there really is a lot more that we all have in common than that divides us. One of the things that was said in a tribute to Mr. Rogers after he died was that he was able to teach kids a really important lesson, which is you are like everybody else, and you are like no one else. That's the kind of intelligence that we want to have, that we can understand. You are like everybody else, and you are like no one else. Conversation I had some years ago with somebody about a neighbor from Wethersfield who had worked for many, many years running the crisis program at HCRS. And this fellow who had worked with him over the years said he broke every rule and he always did the right thing. Part of intelligence is figuring out when is breaking the rule doing the right thing. Obviously, if everybody just said, oh, look, just break every rule and you'll be fine, we'd live in a chaotic, anarchic world. But I think that when I think of some of the people who are the great moral leaders in my mind, I think of people like the Berrigans and Dr. Spock, the William Sloane Coffin, and there were Martin Luther King. There certainly were rules they broke by doing the right thing. Now, I prefer doing services to get a little bit of feedback from you. And so I want to stop for a minute and encourage some response. That's not as much a tradition in this congregation. Is it? Okay,
Yes.
good. Well, then, but I'd like to invite some response. Complexity, contradiction, ambiguity, paradox are all measures of what life really is. And the mark of our intelligence is being able to embrace that and see it and work with that and figure out how to proceed. So, invite some comment, response.
And I would just say, please talk in this direction because the mic is on this camera. And if you speak clearly and distinctly and with enough force, the Zoom people can hear you as well. And the Zoom people, we're happy to have your comments as well. And can you just say your name, your first name?
Helen Whitcomb, do you want me to take this off? Or?
If you're back a little bit and speak up. Yes, that's perfect.
This all hits home with me in this kind of a strange way. But as some of you know, if I can do so safely, I pick dead animals off the road. Not only out of respect for the animal, but also primarily so predators aren't going to be endangered. So I do this a lot, but almost never on like 91. And the other day there was something on 91 black, and it was actually where I could handle it safely. It was off on the side. So I stopped, and it was a really beautiful critter. I had no idea what it was though. It didn't look like any animal that I had ever seen before. I mean, the face was kind of mashed, so was it almost a cross between a fox and a bear cub? It was black. But
Fisher?
I think it was a fisher. That's what somebody else suggested. And I had never actually seen a fisher like that. But it was a beautiful, beautiful animal. And I took it off and it, I'm doing squirrels and chipmunks and possums, occasionally even skunks I do. But this one, it just really, I often tear up, but it really got to me, and I get so angry, with goddamn cars and highways and people, and we can't slow down. I'm doing it too, right? Driving down the highway, and the dichotomy of dealing with the death that we cause, not only by driving at these awful speeds, and not only to each other, but all these other, and then when we make all these roads and the devastation that we wreak upon nature, the highways, how we divide it, the land up, that animals can't, there's no respect to nature, animals, and these stupid roadways. And yet I take part in driving down these roads. So that is an example for me of exactly what you're talking about and how to live with it. And I grapple with it all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Hallie.
Hallie, since you mentioned that, I found this possum. I did a possum that was on the road. We put up by the tail. They were on this side of the road. But as an artist, I don't. Am I talking okay?
Speak a little louder if you could. Just speak up.
All right. As an artist, I find the dichotomy between beauty and what's happening in the world, and it's a real struggle for me. And sometimes when I'm doing a painting, I feel like I should be doing the part that's really beautiful, portraying that, because I think I want people to see that. But yet, a lot of times, my paintings are very dark at the same time. So I have that struggle as an artist. I feel it all the time.
I think of some of the paintings that Robert O'Brien has done, and my brother Charlie, the beauty of peeling paint, the beauty of rust. My brother paints these wonderful things of rotting boxcars. And it is beautiful. It's interesting if you think about a lot of things. If you didn't know the backstory to it, if you didn't know that this, if you didn't know that one is rusty and one is shiny and bright, which would be more interesting to look at between an old wrecked car and a brand new one?
Old and new, like the faces of older people are so, there's so much story in that.
I have a question about possums. Did we used to have as many possums, or is that a result of climate change that we have so many more?
We had no possums back to the 1950s, but they are primarily a result of the interstate highway system. They moved north eating carrion. Climate change helped, but it wasn't.
But the interstates. I hate to think of a whole row of them coming up the interstate, maybe in the breakdown lane. But no, in my aesthetic, they're kind of ugly. But one of my favorite books is a children's book by a woman named Keiko Casa, and it's about Little Joe the possum. So I have a very warm feeling of possums because of that. Some other thoughts before we move on to our closing music.
I do. This is Deb Diegli. I will. Um, yeah, I feel so much for you, Hallie, because yeah, I have the same contradiction, and it's really painful. It's painful living in this world, I think. Um, but Will, as you know, and some of you know, I have spent some time working with people who have been involved in the correctional facility. Um, so I really resonated with your talk today, and um, you know, some people, there was so much good in them, and there's good in everybody, like you say, but some people, like, you really felt they got such a rotten deal, and yet they did something, and most of it was drug related. Um, and that obituary you read about the Webley woman who was just in her 30s and had 4 kids. I mean, you know, I start feeling angry about how the medical system got her addicted on opiates. And yet I know that the doctors who did that were doing that because she must have been in horrible pain, falling on her face on the rocks. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies, we have since found out, lied about, you know, their OxyContin and all those things were not addictive, and of course they obviously were. And so there's a real paradox there. A system that was trying to help actually got this woman addicted, which caused, you know, theft and horrible disruption in her life and harm to her children, and, you know, time in prison or whatever. And there's so many people like that, and they weren't all as a result of medical issues, but a great number of them were. And the people who did it, quote, did it to them, were trying to help them and get them through this terribly painful time in their lives. And look what happened. So there is a real paradox there, and it's hard, but I think, you know, I think that's what life is like. You really got to hold the bad with the good with the bad, and it's very difficult at times. But thank you for that talk.
Close with something that Sally Taylor shared with me a few years ago that came from some teacher of hers, and I think of this phrase a lot. Remember that people are doing the best they can, even when they're not. We'll move on to the closing hymn, We'll Build the Land. One of the things I wanted to just say, you know, there's a lot of stuff about whether we should have statues of people who did some bad things in their life and name roads after them. I agree with a lot of the changes. I think sometimes we need to understand that people were doing the best they could in the time that they lived. When I chose as the final hymn, We'll Build a Land, I didn't think there could be anything controversial about that. But when I wanted to learn a little bit more about Carolyn McDade, I discovered there are some people who don't like this hymn because, and I don't mean to trivialize the concern that some Native Americans feel offended by the idea we'll build a land, that resonates with them about attitudes that existed in American history about we need to settle this land, this unsettled land. And then there are people who don't like the binariness of sisters and brothers. So my father did a poster once with a line that he really liked from James Russell Lowell's poem that became the hymn, Once to Every used to be man a nation, but once every soul a nation, I think it is in this hymn book. Time makes ancient good uncouth. And it's absolutely true. And we can embrace the fact that Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant person who contributed a lot to the world and also slept with a slave. That's who Thomas Jefferson was. Still on the nickel, and maybe someday he won't be. Anyway, thank you all for listening and participating, and we'll close with "We'll Build a Land." And some closing words. Closing words are from T.S. Eliot. What we call a beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time.